going to talk about what to do if you failed the Michigan bar exam. And I want to start by saying I'm really sorry that you failed. I know it can be a devastating thing to go through. A lot of people feel sadness, depression, anger, confusion, embarrassment. Some students even feel hopeless, like they put all this time and money and resources and energy into passing the bar exam. So what can they possibly do differently to pass the next time? So what I'm hoping to do here is give you a brief idea about how to dissect your score report. Because if you know about how far you are from passing, that can tell you what you need to change moving forward so that you pass the next bar exam. So if you have your score report out, you'll see the date, you'll see your address, you'll see your seat number. And the first thing that you're going to see, the first real number that you're going to see that pertains to you is what your MBE scaled score is. So your score report will say something like, your examination results reflect an MBE scaled score of X. So what the Michigan Board of Law Examiners does not tell you is what percentile you fall in. Some people wonder, am I close to passing the MBE? Am I far from passing? I got a 105. Does that mean I only have, 30 points to go and it should be pretty easy to get that or not? So what I'm going to put on the screen is an MBE scaled score percentile chart. So if you look at this chart, you can see the MBE score on the top. So you want to look for whatever score you got. And then you can see your MBE percentile on the bottom. So these are numbers from February 2018. They don't usually release numbers every year. This was actually taken from Illinois before it converted to a UBE state. So these are not going to be the exact numbers, the exact percentile that you scored in, but it should be pretty close. Especially if you're looking at this after the February 2020 bar exam. The February 2020 bar exam was pretty close to the February 18 bar exam in terms of the mean MBE score. Okay, so what you'll learn is, let's say you scored a 100 on the MBE. You're in the bottom 1 percentile, meaning you only scored higher than 1% of examinees taking the bar exam. That means you have a lot of work to do, because in Michigan you want to get a 135, which is closer to 60th percentile. So you actually need to move your score up 60th percent, basically 60 percentile points, which means you have a lot of work to do. It doesn't mean it's impossible. We've had people do it, okay? Definitely possible, but you're going to really have to change your approach, most likely, to get there, unless something extraordinary happened during the bar exam. So if you scored about a 115, then you're in the 12th percentile. So you scored higher than 12% of examinees. You still have a lot of work to do, though. Even though you're 15 points higher than someone who scored 100, you're only 11 percentile points higher, and you still have to move that score up to about the 60th percentile. If you scored between a 130 and a 135, you still got to move your score up, 15% percentile points if you scored a 130. So you still have work to do, but you're much closer than if you scored something like a 105. And again, it's very possible to do this. I'm not trying to discourage anyone who scored low, but I want you to be realistic about your approach. Because if you recognize you have a lot of work to do if you scored low, then you're more likely to tweak your approach or change it significantly to pass the next exam. Okay, then you'll see your individual essay scores. And you'll see 15 scores. These correlate with the 15 questions that have been asked. And there's a couple things I ask for students to look at. A passing score tends to be about a 7. They say aim for a 7. In reality, it's closer to usually a 6.5 to 7. So if you are scoring mostly 7s or 6s, then you're probably within a passing range. But you want to aim for at least a 7 on most of your essays. Another thing to note is if you look at question 9 and question 15, these are the last questions of the session. So question 9 is the last question in the morning session. Question 15 is the last question in the afternoon session. Sometimes I notice students will score really low on questions 8 and 9 or on question 15. And that indicates that they might have a timing problem. So you should see if those happen to be lower. Did you struggle with timing? You should also request your essays from the Michigan Board of Law Examiners, because they will give you your essays and you can evaluate this under a less, under a more clear light. You're not just remembering what you wrote, but you're actually looking at what you wrote. And that can be a valuable source of information. I know that people don't like to request their essays. Nobody wants to read what they wrote on exam day, but do it anyway. It doesn't mean you have to, read them today, but have them so that you can look at them later or give them to someone else to evaluate and tell you how you can improve. We find that sometimes after reading someone's essays, there are very small things that they have to do, and they'll make a big improvement in their essay score. Next, it'll say your raw essay score. You can ignore that for right now and look at the converted essay score. And basically what you want to ask is, how close is that to 135? If you're a 135 or above, you're passing. If it's below 135, you technically didn't pass the essay portion. In Michigan, it doesn't matter. You don't need a 135 on both the MBE and the essay portion. You could get a higher score on the MBE and a lower score on the essay portion. As long as it comes to 135 total, you're good. But for your purposes, when you're evaluating your score report, it's helpful to see, what your overall essay score was and what your overall MBE score was, because this will tell you where you really need to improve. And we find that a lot of people think that they need to improve on the MBE when really they need to improve on the essays, or they need to improve on the essays just as much as they need to improve the MBE score. So looking at that can be beneficial. And then lastly, it'll tell you your overall score. It'll say, using the above calculations, you failed the state bar examination with a combined score of whatever. And again, the closer this is to 135, the closer you are to passing. So if you're between a 130 and a 135, you are pretty close to passing. And you probably even want to consider appealing your score, which you'll have a very tight time frame to do. So make sure to get right on that. Especially if you got something like a 133 or a 134, it's definitely worth considering. It doesn't mean that you have to do it, but look at, evaluate your essays to see if you can appeal. If you're between a 120 and a 130, you're not too far from passing, but you want to make some changes, okay? Because your percentile, you're kind of on the upward end of the curve. Your percentile needs to still go up pretty significantly. So especially if you're closer to like the 120 range or even below that, I would suggest making a more major change to your bar exam approach, like getting a tutor, getting a new course, doing something differently. The other thing I want to remind you of is think about how many times you've taken the bar exam. Like, we helped somebody who took the bar exam 7 times in Michigan, and he was within 5 points of passing every time. But it was his 7th time taking it when he came to us, okay? And so we said, look, you got to do something differently. You should have passed the second time that you took the bar exam, but instead you're taking it over and over again, and he wasn't changing his approach dramatically enough because he thought he was close enough to passing. So if you're in the boat where, you're getting a 130 or, a 129, you're pretty close to passing, but this is your 5th time taking the bar exam, it's time to significantly modify your approach, because you don't want to have to keep taking it over and over again. And the more times you take it, probably the farther you're getting away from your course and your study materials. So it is going to require something different to improve your score. The other thing that you might want to consider is if anything extraordinary happened on exam day. So for example, if you got sick, if a relative died, if you had some kind of emergency, these things can all affect your score and make it artificially low. Even something like a major anxiety issue or panic attack, or a timing issue where you just didn't get to 3 of the essay questions or 20 of the MBE questions, for example, your score might be artificially low and not really reflect how much you know. So that doesn't happen in most cases. I would say that only happens in about, 5% of cases that we see. But consider if anything extraordinary happened while you were taking the bar exam, and then know your score might be a little, artificially low because of that, and maybe you're not as far away from passing as your score would otherwise indicate. So those are my tips on how to dissect your Michigan bar exam score report, and a couple things to consider when you are trying to come up with a study plan for the next bar exam administration.